Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Kwame Owino from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we thank you for sitting with us to discuss our 26th webinar. So today, we'll be discussing, as the program states, we'll be discussing the topic of fragile states, corruption and conflict, and assessing political risks in Africa. But the background to this is that in the month of May and June of this year, the Institute of Economic Affairs, together with the Observer Research Foundation, a partner think tank in India, sat together to ask ourselves what would be the effects of COVID-19 on various sectors of policy areas within the first 100 days, to take stock of the first 100 days after the declaration of the pandemic. And so what we did was to generate a publication, which you can see before you, which is a series of chapters addressing. Hi everyone, please keep your microphones muted so that we do not have feedback. Please keep your microphones muted unless you intend to speak. Thanks. So as I say, the publication that you see right up there, the colorful publication, was the result of 2.5 months of work between the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Observer Research Foundation, partner think tank in India. And what we wanted to cover was to ask ourselves to take stock of the first 100 days since the declaration of COVID-19 as a pandemic, and to ask ourselves what different African countries did, and to synthesize some information to provide what are the early responses, and to record what they mean and how what can be learned from the first 100 days of those. And this report was launched at the end of last month, in mid of July this year. So what we are doing now is that the Institute of Economic Affairs, in this partnership, wrote 3 of the 8 chapters, and we'll be presenting to you in subsequent forums specific chapters explaining our findings in each of those chapters that the IEA wrote. So today, we'll be talking about the first chapter. And so this first chapter is basically about what are the some African states are fragile, they have corruption and even conflict. And so we are trying to assess the political risks in the context of COVID-19. And basically, as you can see, it's a very hopeful title for the whole publication, because it says the day after tomorrow. So what we wanted to do was to synthesize and consolidate the learning over those 100 days in the various chapters, and then to ask ourselves, what does it mean for this? It is possible for us to be discussing right now that in the next 6 months, we'll consolidate another one and have an update of this publication, and we hope you all like it. A link to this publication is available on our website. It's extremely well done and quite interesting in my view, and so it may help you to read in addition to the chapters that the IEA has contributed to the other chapters. So I'll state quickly that the chapter that we're going to discuss was written by my colleague Jacqueline Kagume, who will introduce herself, and Leo Kemboi. Jacqueline is the head of our program on law and economy, and Leo Kemboi is an assistant program officer responsible for research in that program as well. And they wrote a chapter on fragile states, corruption and conflict, and together they'll be making presentations. One half and the other will be making presentations on what their findings are, and they will very quickly open up to plenary discussions. But just before I ask them to speak, let me just take it here. Remind you that the IEA wrote 3 chapters. So those chapters were, the first one was political risks, which is what we're going to discuss. The next one was on macroeconomic responses, which was the fiscal policy responses, how the government respond in terms of taxes, and how the government respond in terms of expenditure. And the third one was resilience. Again, as we say, we intended for the publication to be hopeful and looking to the future, learning from the past, and trying to consolidate those lessons. And the second part would therefore be the 3rd. So over the next 3 weeks, every week we'll make a presentation of the chapters that we are responsible for, and after that, we should work together with our colleagues in Observer Research Foundation to discuss the other chapters after this. So please note that this is the 25th webinar. I think this is the 26th webinar that the IEA, 25th webinar that the IEA has covered. Has held over the last few months, and we're glad that you're here to participate in it. So I just ask 2 rules: please keep your microphones muted and your cameras as well, so that when the presentations are going on, you only focus on the presenters. And then when we open up the discussion, as you ask a question, you can ask a question and you can switch on the camera as you ask the question, so that everybody else can see. So Jackie, welcome.
All right, thanks Kwame, and good morning everyone. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, as Kwame has introduced me, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We are pleased that you are able to join us for this discussion today, and I think Kwame has provided the broad overview of the entire publication and the reason to why we are here today. So, as he has stated, we will be discussing a chapter in this report a day after tomorrow, and my colleague Liu and I were tasked with mapping risks, political related risks in Africa, and how those may have an effect in terms of government's response to crises and emergencies, and specifically in the context of the COVID-19. So I'll begin by taking you through a quick outline of our presentation. So we'll have the introduction, which will provide the context of this chapter, which Kwame has discussed largely. Then I'll provide a brief background into the risks that we identified. And this, I think, are already listed here. We have risks due to government instability, weak state capacity, conflicts, neopatrimonialism, and corruption. And we'll do this together with my colleague. So I'll do the background and highlight the first 2 risks, and then I'll invite my colleague Leo to take us through the other 2 risks and a conclusion. This should not take us too much time, so hopefully in 25 to 30 minutes, the 2 of us should be done with this presentation. So, going into the introduction, the title of the chapter is Fragile States, Corruption and Conflicts, an Assessment or Assessing Political Risk in Africa. So why was this important to be stated in this chapter? Why assess fragility and political risks? So we sought to establish, is there a connection, or is there any nexus between pre-existing political risks in countries and how those affect nations or individual countries and the way they respond to crisis? So if you read the report, which we provided a link to, the chapter starts from page 46 and goes all the way to page 53. And we started by stating that at the beginning of this crisis, a group of African ministers, the ministers in charge of finance in their country, in various countries, came together and issued a communique, basically were stating, just go back, Leo, yeah, basically stating that different countries in Africa would be affected or would bear the cost of the crisis disproportionately. They were calling for an increase or for help or allocation of specific funds to go towards addressing the COVID crisis, and this allocation they were calling for was specifically for fragile states. So in their own way, they were recognizing and stating that yes, most states in Africa are actually fragile and would require specific assistance in terms of responding to this emergency. So of their own admission, the states, poorer states or different states in Africa are faced with some peculiar vulnerabilities which would require assistance or more targeted help in terms of responding to the crisis. So, and this fragility, we thought to check what's the connection between fragile states and political risks. What are these risks that actually cause the states to be termed as fragile? So as I've stated, we thought we are basically just trying not to establish the link that exists between the country's ability to respond to crises, as was expressed by this group of ministers, and then check to see, based on what has been established previously as different states' capacity, how have different states bearing different capacities been able to respond to crisis, and has this had any bearing, has this been informed by their existing structures politically? So I think, yes, that's it for the introduction. I'll just move to the next slide. So going now into the background of this, it's still connected to the introduction, but the background of this, I will make an assumption that by now we all understand the nature of COVID-19 in terms of its history, and its evolution up to date. So I'll only state broadly that it's been with us from the end of last year, and in Africa, mainly we saw the first cases being announced at the beginning of the year from around March. And so since then, we have seen different countries responding differently. So again, as I have stated, bearing in mind and assuming that most of us already understand the evolution of the disease, we'd like to establish and see what has contributed to different countries' responses. So when we talk about political risks, what exactly do we mean, and how can this be distinguished from economic risks? So in our study, in our research, we established that political risks are basically the risks that can be attributed to the way a government functions or the way governments respond to different things. So if you try to define political broadly, the term political, it's that related to politics. And when we look at politics, it has it's related to activities around decision making. So basically, how governments function, how laws are formulated, and policies. Just looking at the political environment of different countries, and so having established what relates to political risks, what we identified as some of the factors in terms of how different governments in Africa responded or respond to this crisis. We were able to highlight and establish a few risks or factors that have had an impact in terms of how different states have responded to the crisis. So we found that the first, we had risks related to government instability. Then we had risks related to weak state capacity. We had risks related to conflict, and risks related to corruption and neopatrimonialism. And the last two set of risks will be discussed by my colleague. So we wanted to try and see, looking at government stability, has the way different governments function, and looking at the stability of different countries, has it had any impact in terms of the way they've responded? Have they been affected? Have the effects been disproportionate or proportional to stability in different countries? So I will later on refer to data that we got from an index, that's the Fragile States Index, that basically provided us with information regarding classification of different states in terms of their fragility, in terms of their stability. There's a set of indicators that demonstrate what is then ranked as government's fragility. Looking at the first set of risks that we identified, we had risks due to government instability. And here, just broadly stating, the World Bank estimates that by 2050, nearly 2/3 of the world's poor will reside in an unstable country. So, kindly mute your mic. Thank you. So for a country to demonstrate stability, we found that it must serve as a responsible steward of state resources. So stability is informed by government's accountability, transparency, and ability to discharge of its functions accordingly, basically in terms of guided by its laws and in strict conformity to its laws and policies. So we found that government officials must be held accountable to establish political and legal processes, which should be entirely independent. This is just a broad definition of what was termed as government stability. So looking at the Fragile States Index, which I have just mentioned previously, we relied on data from this index to try and see, based on what is in that index, stating what countries, how countries rank in terms of stability, in terms of their ability to perform different functions. We wanted to see whether countries that are ranked as fragile or less fragile, how they responded to the COVID-19 crisis. And we wanted to see, based on how these are ranked, is there any relationship, correlation between that and testing capacity, or how countries have been able to respond to this. We know that from the evolution of the disease or the nature of the disease, we've seen that, we know that right now testing of the disease, tracing of contacts, quarantine and treatment are now essential government services. It's essential, they can only be listed as essential services, and so we wanted to see, does a provision of these services, is there a way we can relate it to what we can see as being listed as government stability, and also looking at different states, how fragile they or unfragile they are, how does that relate? So go to the next slide. So looking at the Fragile States Index, this is just a highlight of some of the countries. We did not pick all of them. So Somalia was ranked as the second most fragile country globally. We had Congo, Democratic Republic, the Central African Republic. We had Burundi as 11th. Kenya came in as 29th. South Africa 85th. Botswana is 121st. Now, what we can say about this index is the higher a country is ranked, the worse its performance, rather the poorer it has performed. So, so to state that Somalia was honestly performing very badly here, and I think the first ranked country was Yemen. But given that we're looking at African states, this is how the ones that we highlighted performed in terms of that index. And this Fragile States Index can be assessed at a link that we've provided here. And as I've stated before, it basically maps a set of indicators and looks at states' ability to properly discharge of their mandates. It looks at certain things, including security threats, state legitimacy. It looks at different trade indicators. And basically what this index is highlighting is, or saying, or when classifying states as fragile, is basically looking at the propensity of states or likelihood of states to collapse if exposed to certain factors. So this is how countries performed. You can see Kenya is 29, and having looked at this here examples, we wanted to see, based on how they've been ranked in terms of this index, is how have they been responding in terms of addressing the crisis, the COVID emergency. And again, as I've mentioned, some of the key services that government is expected to provide in response to this is testing, tracing, quarantine, and treatment. And so we also sought to find out, can we link this to how different tests have been administered for the COVID-19 in the different countries. So go to the next slide. So this is data that we had as at the end of June, which was the time of preparation of this report. So by that time, looking at Burundi, they had been ranked 11. We could not even find the data regarding how many people were tested, daily tests per 1,000 people. Then we also tried to find data regarding the number of daily tests per 1,000,000 people. So for Burundi, we could not find. Nigeria, we found that the number of tests per 1,000,000 people was 60. Uganda was 70. Sorry, Kenya was 60, Uganda was 70, Rwanda was 300, and South Africa was 580. You can see this is 500. When we say 580 in South Africa, we're saying that by the time of preparation of this report, which was the end of June, South Africa was able to test 580 people per the population of 1 million. Kenya was able to test around 600 people per 1 million. That's by the end of June. These numbers have not changed very significantly to date, because we were just trying to do those calculations with my colleague here this morning. They changed very marginally, but if you go back to the slide before, Leo, just go back to the slide before. You can see Kenya, where Kenya ranks and where South Africa ranks, and then you can see Burundi, for instance, which was ranked 11, way up in the Fragile State Index, and then looking at their response or their ability to conduct tests. In the next slide, just go to the next slide. Yes, you can still see that there is clearly a link. A country that has been listed as more stable or less fragile, like South Africa, it seems to have more stable systems thanks its ability to conduct 580 tests by the time of compilation of this data. Go to the next slide. So yeah, in summary, what I'm stating, or what that slide is stating, is that the COVID testing and fragility seem to be highly correlated, and confirm that citizens of fragile states are likely to suffer disproportionately. I've talked about the testing, tracing, and treatment. These are now primary and essential services offered by government. And from what our findings were in this study, it seems unlikely that unstable governments, which have weak systems, will be able to respond effectively in the event of a surge in COVID-19 cases. I think we also, the case in Burundi, which we've seen was ranked 11 in that analysis. We were not even able to collect data regarding the tests they were conducting per day, but we did see them sending some of, there were allegations that they did send some of senior persons in their government to come and receive treatment here. We also had allegations that the former president succumbed to the COVID allegation, but again, you can see that sort of link between countries that have had over 3 decades of political instability and their health system being almost non-existent, weak or non-existent. So I think we can see that link. Go to the next slide. So the next set of risks that we identified were those related to weak state capacity, and there's a close relationship between what we are referring to here and also those related to government instability. So we are saying that state capacity is best illustrated again by the state's ability to implement its decision in a manner that conforms to its laws. South Africa was again an example that was illustrated here as having a pre-existing social welfare structure, well established. Prior to this, they were supporting about 30% of their population with monthly cash transfers. And for a country that already has a system like this, it became much easier for them to now base their COVID emergency response to an already existing structure. So South Africa, as we can see, they were able to respond easier because they already had pre-existing systems. For others, there are different other countries that had to start from scratch. I should have mentioned here, in the report we mentioned for a country like Togo, for instance, had to start building a system for this monthly cash transfers to the vulnerable population. They have to start building it from scratch. You can imagine beginning to put in structures from scratch once when the pandemic is already in existence. So it helps for countries that already had these systems in place before. It became easier for them to respond. Botswana, on the other hand, we've also seen that Botswana is actually ranked lower than South Africa in the Fragile States Index, meaning it's performed even better than South Africa, so it's ranked as less fragile. And they've had one of the most remarkable responses to the COVID-19 based on our research. First of all, they managed to control the number of infections in the country, and keep it very minimal. I know some people have argued that yes, that could be linked to the low population that they have, but still looking at the structures in place, even in spite of the population, it would have been much higher had they not already been having stable systems. They've had a stable government for a long period of time, and they have a good health system and basically stable structures to be able to respond to the crisis. So we've seen that some of their responses have been food distribution schemes, wage subsidies for farms, price freezes on essential items, and actually, again, from our research, we found that by the first week of this COVID, as soon as this was established, the government was able to provide free tests in Botswana at their 4 border points. So again, we try to look at this strong response and see whether it links to the fragility of the state or the state capacity. And again, here it's the data or the evidence clearly illustrates that yes, enhanced or better state capacity has contributed to the strong or the good response that the country has had. So I think I've talked about the example of Burundi, and again, just to mention, in South Africa, I remember they set aside a specific, was it a $26 billion budget specifically for, Leo will confirm this amount, but it was a specific COVID budget targeted at responding to this. So again, we see that countries that basically have what can be termed as a better capacity are able to even put aside specific resources to address this in a more appropriate way. In the subsequent webinars or discussions that we're going to have on this, looking at the economic response, as Kwame had mentioned earlier, we are also going to be providing more illustrations of the way different countries have responded in terms of different economic packages, in terms of putting in mitigation measures that have been targeted mainly at cushioning citizens from the adverse economic effects on the disease. So for Burundi, I mentioned, so we have those 3 examples. We have South Africa's response, we have Botswana's response, and Burundi's response. And again, this we see linking very directly to how the countries are classified when we look at the stability and when we look at the state capacity. So I think I will stop there. Go to the next slide, Leo. Next slide. Yes, I think I'll stop there because Leo will take us from there.
Thank you, Jackie. So, my name is Leo Kemboy. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Now, I'd finished, so I'm going to discuss. So that
Leo, there's background
yes.
noise inside, please.
Okay. I'm using my. So, risks due to conflict. Majority of most of the African countries, especially around the Sahel, most of the countries around the Sahel region, and the Lake Chad basin have the problems of conflict. They have either civil wars that are ongoing and some uprising in one form or another. So conflict, basically, when a pandemic comes to, what is required is the ability of government to organize, to come up with the action plan and the implementation towards it, so that they are able to slow down the pandemic. And in this case, to organize testing, treatment, and just generally building capabilities to be able to respond to the pandemic. And it requires planning, capability, which is resources, and training, especially to medical personnel, to be able to. And another thing is, especially for an infectious disease like this one, you require large-scale behavioral changes, and these including like wearing a mask, physical distancing. It means that closing, for example, like entertainment places and the rest of stuff. However, this is possible in countries that are going through the normal, like they have no conflicts. For countries with conflicts, most of the people are on run, and it's the general peace that is required for governments to be able to plan and respond to pandemics is not there. Even both at either individual farm or at country at state level. So it weakens. So there have been studies even before the pandemic that generally conflicts affect provisions of public services, and majorly education and health. So and we could see that some of the countries that have conflicts, some of the countries in the fragile state index, which are up there, that are very fragile, that risk collapse, are the ones that have not been able to marshal up capacity properly to be able to respond to the pandemic. So across the world, there are 48 fragile and conflict-affected countries. And if you read in the reports, we looked there is a database that actually tracks conflicts across the world on a daily basis. So most of these countries are in Africa, and they include Mozambique, South Sudan, DRC, Somalia, Nigeria, and the Central African Republic and Libya. And we saw reporting like 2 days ago that there is the ISIS group that has overrun the port in Mozambique, and this affects generally the capability of the state to be able to respond to the pandemic, and especially to COVID-19. So risks due to neopatrolism. So this is a political science term. Most political scientists use this term, and it actually means that resources, the state resources, are distributed around a well-connected person. So it emerges through the vertical distribution of resources, which give rise to highly connected individuals around a leader in a government position or the party. So, and one of the ways how this neopatrolism thrive is that someone in the position of authority uses resources to specific places or specific individuals. So, and how is this going to affect the COVID-19? It's likely to affect, it has affected, and this is, we can use the example of Kenya. It has affected the crisis in two ways: allocation of resources and accountability of funds. Because individuals around the leader in government position or the party are using that authority bestowed upon the leader to benefit themselves in one way or another, either their specific regions. So neopatrolism, like for example, the case of Kenya. Earlier, when the pandemic began in February, we were looking for we did internet searches for some of the countries and how they are responding. When we looked, for example, for the UK, a pandemic requires you prepare an incident action plan. This is, you are detailing your strategy. You are saying, one, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this, and in doing this, we are going to reduce the spread of the disease by this margin. And that is a public document. So once that one becomes a public document, the policy makers are then able to cost these strategies. And when you are costing, so it's based on a science approach. You are trusting the science and saying, this is what you are doing. So, and it's a whole process. By the time you're putting it there, it's an agreement, it's a consensus, especially because resource allocation is a political decision across the divide. However, for example, for the specific case of Kenya, we're still looking for, this is the incident action plan. This is what we've planned. The ministry has planned, the policymakers at the top have planned on how to contain the pandemic. And this is the cost of each of the strategy. And now this is what is going to be bought by these specific departments. However, for us, we've not been able to see. And you've seen, I don't want to dwell on that one, you've seen media reporting about this and about how the pandemic resources. The National Treasury confirmed that they've dispersed 134 billion so far, of which most of the Kenyans, they don't believe that amount has been dispersed. And so neopatrolism, actually, power is consolidated around a political party or regiment leaders who dispense the largesse using government resources. And then Neopatrolism states the allocation of resources is decided based on the wishes of political class and not on data, evidence, and need. Yes. So, and then to dwell on this, the articles were written earlier in May, stating that for this pandemic should go the risk-based management way. Like, for example, we've seen most of the countries, like in Africa, Senegal was able to design a COVID-19 test that costs $1. For us, with the existing machines that have been used to test HIV, and we could be able to, Cambridge confirmed that they would be able to design a test that could be a little bit cheaper. Our estimation is it could be $20. So if you have $20, if you want to test 1 million Kenyans, just random testing, and to be able to determine, and testing in this is not a medical diagnosis, it's just to lead to a conclusion that someone is to self-isolate. If we are being able to do that to 1 million Kenyans, it would cost us 2 billion. And even if we plan for 6 months, that would have costed 12 billion, and we would have been able to slow the spread of that disease considerably. So, because of Neopatrolism, this approach did not go the science way, and we already have evidence now that Kenya, in terms of the resources that were allocated, this did not go the proper way. It did not go based on evidence, data, and need. So another risk is the corruption risks. So of course, corruption has been a systemic and structural problem for us in Africa. At the IEA, we did two studies. We did a study on the procurement, and then we did an analysis of the Auditor General reports and across 4 departments, and we came to one conclusion, that the most perverse corruption risk in Kenya is the procurement fraud. And already we've been able to say that even to parliamentarians. And one of the things that as COVID struck, there were fears that resources allocated to dealing with the pandemic could be greatly misused, because we know these are the same corruption, the procurement structures that are still there, and if money is going through the same system that has been losing money for the last 10 years or the last 20-30 years, it's the same thing that is going to happen. So across Africa, the CSOs and development partners called for open and transparent public procurement processes. Yes, there were there were almost 100 CSOs across the world that came up and wrote to the managing director, both for the World Bank, David Malpass, and the IMF, Georgieva Krest. So both they were calling that what has been the primary instruments for dispersing emergency funding, the rapid credit facility and rapid financing instruments, it constrains the IMF's ability to implement robust anti-corruption measures. Because especially in the time of need, and people really needed urgently those PPEs, community safety nets, all those things that were required for government to be able to for treatment and for treatment, contact tracing, and all those health protocols. Most of the argument is that there should have been robust anti-corruption measures put in place so that in this specific country. So, like to give an example, the government of South Africa and prepared in its own motion, prepared a specific coronavirus budget. So for them, this is now, they costed everything on community safety nets and responding to the pandemic. So if it's about increasing public health officers, that one was costed, and it was a specific budget so that the parliament and the non-state actors could be able to track this. Where is this money going? The government of Gabon, when they were applying for the resources, committed to creating specific COVID-19 expenditures. So for us in Kenya, of course, we were not able to create, the policymakers were not able to create the coronavirus specific budget. And I believe that this has been the undoing, because if Treasury are not confirmed, for example, that to Parliament, that this is what was dispersed for the COVID-19 related specific expenditures, would have never known, because the way the budget was prepared, if you look at the budget for this year for the Ministry of Health, it's around 111 billion. However, the COVID-19 specific expenditure surpassed that. So it would have been good for this specific version, specific expenditure, so that we can be able to know about those corruption risks. So in that letter, the non-state actors across the world called for openness and transparency in procurement processes by publishing details of contract, and specifically including the beneficial ownership. So, as you know, this is a Kenyan thing, and across the world, that proxies, that influential, politically exposed persons or influential people in government hide behind proxies so that they register those companies and they are able to get contracts. So those non-state actors called for beneficial ownership so that we know who are benefiting from this tender specific. So someone has started sharing. Please, kindly don't share the presentation. Oh, Fuller. Sorry for that.
Mr. Nabutola. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So they must publish the beneficial ownership, and the beneficial ownership is that person behind who is behind the proxies, who is benefiting from those government procurement, and so when we check the government of Kenya's request to rapid credit facility for access of the rapid credit facility at the IMF, they committed that they will publish as it happens, as the contracts are issued, they will publish them on the www.tenders.gok. So when I looked at this August time, 2020, there was no COVID-19 related contracts. Actually, there were no contracts for this financial year. The last year was 2018-2019. The contracts published there were for 2018-2019. So it's important, and as we go forward, even for, I know the Minister of Health petitioned Parliament by himself, saying that the murky issues at the Ministry of Health, he cannot go around it, and he supplied documents, including Ministry of Health and KEBS, including the tests, the allegations that the certification process at Kenya Bureau of Standards was marred with corruption issues. So the most important thing, and as the most important lesson for corruption, is that transparency. Once things come out and the documents are published, it will be easy for us to be able to know. Another thing, earlier when there was an article that was done, we did together with Comment about the patient management cost, and what the main issue we're responding to is that the cost of PPEs. The principal secretary has said the cost of PPEs. What we did, we went to the Alibaba and Amazon and looked at the most expensive suits, and most of them were ranging around an average of $40, and those ones are the high end, but the list were around $14, $15. However, here at that time, people were selling those the Nini with almost $200. So for PPEs, and another one that we also did when the president ordered for the beds that done by the youth here in Kenya, there was a specific beds, and I know it was widely reported, and most of you know it. When the president ordered for them to be bought, they were being bought between around 50 to 68,000, around there. So we went to the same site and looked for electric beds, the most expensive one. So an electric bed, the most modern version of an electric bed that is safe and has been certified by regulators across the world, costs around $120, which is 12,000. And the cheaper one would cost around $50, which is 5,000. So ranging between 5,000 and the Nini. But the president wanted these beds to be bought. If you're buying 200 beds, for example, at that price of almost between $500 to $600, that's a lot of money going to. So you are buying an equivalent of one bed, one modern bed, and an electric bed, which is an manual 1 year that you're buying from a youth in Kenya would be equivalent to 5 beds. So that difference. So, and the most important thing is in procurement, especially as you procure, is competition and openness of the process. So as you know also that there are media reports that the private donation of equipment and supplies worth to about $2 million by Chinese billionaire Jack Ma could not be accounted for. And this has also been confirmed by the Minister of Health. He was asked in the briefing and he was able to confirm. So Africa has witnessed a fair share of corruption risks. And we could mention more across Africa of similar nature. But the most important thing as we go forward is how this is going to be dealt with. So, Jackie, conclusion. So I end my presentation there, and thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Leo has discussed the risks related to corruption and neo-patrimonialism, as well as conflict. And so in conclusion, what we are saying here is that this COVID emergency has demonstrated stark weaknesses in state capacity. We've given the examples here in Kenya in terms of corruption, and also the examples that he gave linked to neo-patrimonialism. We've also highlighted some examples related, for instance, in Burundi, and how they've been able to respond to the crisis. So overall, we are seeing that in Africa, the response seems to be that there are certain weaknesses in a state capacity which have encumbered or hindered states' response to the crisis. So most countries in Africa have particularly fragile governance systems, and that shows the effects of that shows when it comes to responding to crises. The greater resources that are mobilized, the higher risks of corruption and diversion of funds earmarked for COVID-19 expenditures. That was the last point that Leo has made in his presentation regarding to use of COVID funds and the likely corruption that is likely to arise from that. And yes, we've also basically in a nutshell, we've talked about corruption, neopatrimonial, with states' capacity, government instability, and conflict risks have completely hampered Africa's response to the COVID-19. And all these are political factors. And what we are saying that is that these factors are likely to, rather unstable political environment is likely to reduce investment and also may slow down like the state or the pace of economic development across the continent. So these factors need to be addressed because there's clearly a connection. The factors political stability and economic growth are deeply interconnected, and therefore for this there's need for to address some of these factors in order to enhance states' response to crises, to emergencies such as this in future. And yes, in conclusion, those were our main findings. I think I'll give this back to Kwame. That's the conclusion for our chapter on political risks and how they have affected states' response to crisis.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Jackie and Leo. So I'll just make 2 points and then I'll open up for a discussion from everyone. So the first is basically that my colleagues Jackie and Leo have considered 4 main. I mean, we are asking ourselves that what's the state of fragility of African countries? And remember, we are not talking about the African continent. We are measuring fragility at country level. And the chart that was shown from the Fragile States Index first shows that a majority of the countries in the top 25% of most fragile countries are actually African countries. Given that obviously we have Burundi, we have Somalia, we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then of course a varying degree of fragility. And yet they are also very stable countries in Africa. Now the reason state fragility is an important factor is basically because when you have a shock, such as a pandemic, one of the first things that happens is the institutional ability of the state to execute functions becomes most salient, in the sense that the ability of the state to actually execute functions, of which public health management and actually pandemic control is one of them, then becomes immediately apparent. If we have state fragility on the other side, then we actually understand that the challenges will be much bigger than they would otherwise have been. And in many ways, I think that claim by this paper has been observed, both in Kenya, but also in the neighborhood. So it states that, for instance, Africa is the only country in the world in which a serving head of state has actually died because of COVID-19. We mentioned here, of course, the sad case in Burundi, where President, of course, he was an outgoing president waiting to hand over. The handover had to take place much earlier than was anticipated because the serving president or the outgoing president died. We also understand that in South Sudan as well, an entire cabinet had to be taken into isolation because of the spread of the disease, and there was a fear as well. Some generals and even some members of the cabinet also lost their lives. So when you see that and correlate it to state fragility and the question about the ability to execute state functions, which public health management, even for the state officers, is essential and was failing, then the claim that Jackie and Leo are making is actually quite plausible and actually proven right. The second issue they did in terms of state capacity was basically conflict. Again, in situations of conflict, the possibility that disease control will take place is compromised by virtue of the fact that if the state does not have the ability to actually control everybody, then there's the fear that this might happen. It hasn't happened as much in other places, but we also know that in our neighboring countries of Somalia, for instance, in some parts of South Sudan that are less risky, there's been zero management of this pandemic in terms of who gets isolated, for instance, the tests that take place and that ability. The factor that we are dealing with in Kenya is also neopatrimonialism. Now, neopatrimonialism is just basically, it has been claimed that many developing countries on the political side of their development have patrimonial governments, where basically the government and people in parts of government, whether through their political party or whether through the military, actually deep into state affairs quite a bit, so that they do not perform their functions just as officers of the state, but they also trade with the state. They get contracts on behalf of the state and they trade those contracts outside. So they're very, very involved. And what the state buys is what these people will sell. I think we've seen an aspect of that in Kenya, not just regarding the patrimonial, not just regarding COVID-19, but of course COVID-19 has once again highlighted that. But also we know every time we've had corruption, big cases in the last 3 or 4 years, fine, none of them has been completed. It's either fallen on one side, in one office in the executive, or in the other office in the county government, suggesting that people with political power at the same time have a predatory relationship with the state, where state resources are done, and where state resources are actually appropriated. And what Jackie and Leo are arguing is, let's examine this, and they've examined quite a bit. So if you look at it in South Africa, one which is fragile, has high indices of corruption. Kenya, all the countries that have these high indices of corruption and all that have registered the inability to account. Even in Nigeria, in other parts of this continent, so that basically the accountability for the funds that were provided for managing COVID-19 in Kenya, we all understand the show that was on one of the TV stations yesterday, it's very clear. And when you examine the thread, the businesses might have different names and different, but when you examine the threads, it comes too close to people either who sit in the cabinet or their relatives. And that's basically it. So once again, those risks and their correlation to corruption are completely clear. Then, of course, just obvious theft and corruption. So corruption can also be both in terms of patrimonialism, but neopatrimonialism, but it can also be in terms of Kenya, and Leo illustrated. There is no reason, there is completely no reason why a poor country such as Kenya should be buying PPE suits, which is a suit, personal protection equipment, and those suits, right, at 14 times what the US buys for. Whatever it is, whether it's because we are manufacturing them locally or not, because what that means is the opportunity costs of Kenya's public money is actually much higher than it is in other parts of the world. So we get concerned when we hear it said that let's buy beds from Kenyans, let's buy beds from Kenyan institutions, when the Kenyan who's making that has not been globally certified, because these standards are global. And at the same time, they are charging rates that are 5 times higher than what an equivalent that meets standards and is globally certified basically does. So all these things tells you about the dysfunction of the state, and how the dysfunctions and even functions of the state. So we have the good examples of Rwanda. We have the good example of Botswana, for instance, in Senegal, where the state uses its own capacity, and they're not much bigger, the biggest states in Africa, but they use their state capacity in fairly competent ways to deliver the best possible health systems in a situation of crisis, such as what we do. So I think we've walked through, and perhaps you should read the article, because you should read it's chapter 3 of the article. You should walk through it, because as we walk through this, we understand that one of the biggest threats that government could manage, or functions that government could manage, is public health provision, which is given to government completely. And pandemic control is an obvious one, because it actually brings in what government should, how government should respond. It's yet too early, but we'll be able to tell. But it is very, very clear that in Kenya's case, when the paper was being written, the 2 million donation by Jack Ma, a private citizen from China, donated to African countries. In Kenya, the equipment came into the country, it disappeared at the airport, which is supposed to be a security zone. We are told that the airports are security zones in Kenya. For some reason, equipment worth almost, 20 or 30 tons disappears from the airport, and then it is sold back to government at elevated rates. And today we understand about, we see that some investigations are going on, of course, which also become political about who's being pursued for one thing or the other. But on the whole, what this tells you is that as citizens, we ought to be concerned about the state fragility. And state fragility in this country is often seen only in terms of the government being able to control crowds or to prevent people from doing certain things that they need to do. But when a public health crisis, which is not necessarily itself about people or politics, we see government failures, and that suggests to us that these governments are far more fragile. Some governments are also very strong, but the question of strong states in Africa and strong states here, from our survey and our synthesis of the information in these 100 days, tells us that this continent, our country as well, and even the region, has extremely fragile states. And it would take anything, not just the political ones, but even a public health crisis for some of these states to collapse or actually to cause significant damage to their people. So what you're seeing is that the fragile states meeting a crisis of this kind actually leads to more deaths and suffering of the population than is necessary. So I think with that, I'll open up this for the conversation, for discussions. So what I'll do is this: there's a on the floating bar, there's a hand raising facility. There's a facility to raise hands, so you can raise your hands and ask a question. Please just introduce yourself and ask a question directly. You can either ask it to Jackie or Leo, or make it as a general comment, and any one of them will answer. So we'll take 5 questions at a time, and then I'll come back for the second round. So if anybody has questions, please do that. If you cannot, you can also send it to the chat box facility, and then I'll read out your questions to them. Can we have the first questions, please? Any questions? I hope I'm not missing anyone. I can't see any questions. Okay, let me have comments then. Let's have your comments or questions. I cannot see that. Okay, let me ask the question myself here. So first, I'll ask Jackie and Leo. I think in the presentation that you made, one of the first, the insightful things that you added was the question, the fragile state index. Maybe you can explain to our audience, I mean to those in this discussion, what are the components of the fragile state index, and why do you think they are related to the state capability as you measured it here? So Jackie or Leo can answer that question. Jackie, go ahead. Jackie, are you here? Leo?
Sorry, Kwame, I thought my mic was muted. So as we mentioned earlier, the Fragile States Index is based on a conflict assessment framework. So there's different indicators that are established basically to provide a rank in terms of how different states perform and how this affects their legitimacy or their capacity. And yeah, so basically there are different sets of indicators. We thought this was a useful tool to use to gauge, because it actually assesses different countries across the globe, not only in Africa. It's looking at the indicators and how these countries perform. For example, there's an assessment of security apparatus, different economic factors, looking at economic decline and even economic development, how states offer public services, human rights, adherence to human rights and the rule of law, different demographic pressures. So they basically different indicators overall, and they use this to be able to measure how these are connected to state capacity. So when a country performs one way or another across the different indicators, then they're able to rank and see whether this means that the state is to be classified as a fragile state, or just it also used to measure state capacity. So we thought that this is an important indicator for us, since it then shows how countries to different across the different indicators, then it also has a link in how they respond to crises, how they respond to emergencies, and different situations that have an economic, whose effect is economic shock. I don't know if Leo would like to add anything.
Yes. So the specific meaning that it's run. So they look at the security apparatus. So fractionalized elites. They look at grievances, group grievances, and how they're dealt with. They looked at the economy. They looked at economic inequality. They look at human flight and brain drain. So these are look at how people, whether people want to leave the country or and how frequent they do. So they look at state legitimacy, provision of public services. So they look at human rights and how they observe. So they look at also demographic pressures. They look at the issue of refugees and IDPs. How many refugees are there in the country, especially internally? Yes, and external intervention, whether there's an external intervention in the country.
All right. Okay. Thanks a lot. So basically, what I mean to summarize, what is the Fragile State Index is a composite index that tells us it's developed by an institution called the Fund for Peace, the Global Fund for Peace, and basically what it does is puts together, I think, about 10 or 12 factors that determine the fragility of a state, starting with fractionalized elites, the risks of violence, the risks of state breakup, inability of the state to provide essential public services, control of corruption and budgets and stuff like that, and obviously the degree of political development in general. So if you take it as a composite measure of the fragility of a state, I think you can plot it, and as the two of them did it, it seems to suggest that it's actually indicative of the ability of a state to perform in a situation of an emergency or a crisis such as this. So we'll provide, I think I'll provide a link as well. I've copied the link and I've provided it through the chat box. So those who would like to, please have a look at it, and it might help you to learn a little bit more. And if you wish to have a conversation, I think that would be a useful one. Perhaps Jackie and Leo could just take one of these days and take us through Kenya's results, because it ranks every country, gives them a number, and then based on that it ranks them, suggesting why they are. So I put a link on the chat box for all of us. Can I have another question? Any other? Well, Jackie and Leo, it looks like everybody seems to be sat. Oh yeah, there seems to be a question. Hello. Yeah.
Hello, how are you, Kwame?
Fine, thank you. Please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Duncan Chando from Kenya Correspondents Association. Yeah, I just wanted to ask in terms of the fragility index, you find that the last fragility index indicated that Kenya, in terms of human rights, there was some improvement. Yet, I think during, we know that in terms of the whole aspect of civic space has been really diminishing in Kenya right now. So maybe from the researchers, maybe in their own opinion, based on what we experienced during COVID, do they think that the aspect of human rights, has it been improving, or the COVID situation, it has really decreased? So just a question, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Duncan. Can we have another question? Any other? Let's see if there's another question. Okay, Jackie and Leo, please respond to that.
Okay, thanks, Duncan, for that question. I think the last index that we have, the 2020 index, I think was prepared just before the emergence of this emergency, or before the actual spread of this. I think the ranking subsequently will show different results. because looking at adherence to human rights, we also what happened in terms of police brutality and the numerous complaints that have been registered over this period of the COVID, and we also saw different civil society organizations actually come together. We had riots and different memoranda issued against police brutality and complaints made. So I believe in the next index that will be prepared, if you look at the human rights indicator, there'll be different results, and it's likely to, in my view, this is a personal view, it's like the results are likely to decline or to be worse performance, to record a worse performance than what we had currently, because at the time of preparation of this, that had not been considered. The response that we saw by our police and just basic respect for human rights and the management of the curfew, what we had at the beginning did not reflect very well in terms of our respect for human rights here. So I think if you're asking about whether that it's a fair result that has been recorded currently in terms of human rights, maybe yes, at the time of development of this index, but looking at the subsequent one, then we'll only be able to find the data, current data of what has happened now in the subsequent one, and it will probably show then.
Leo, do you have a question?
Yes, I think Jackie has answered sufficiently that, and I also believe that the index will change and to reflect that. Remember, in the earlier days of the campaign of the pandemic, when the pandemic had been, before we started seeing the surge in the number of deaths, there were more people killed by police than what COVID had killed them. So that will be noted, and I think the index will change.
All right. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. So what I'll do is I'll just ask Jackie and Leo. I'll start with Leo for each of you to just make any concluding remarks, and then Jackie will make that, and then we can close. Oh, okay. There's a hand. I saw a hand by Kihu. Is there a hand?
Yes, I had a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm well aware that the topic of discussion was fragile states and corruption, fragile state corruption and conflict, assessing political risks in Africa. So our discussion was kind of tied to Africa. But do you find it necessary maybe to place Africa's response in relation to the rest of the world? Well, for example, when you look at the developed world, like the US, despite them being despite their comparatively better health systems, they had to even put medical tents outside New York Central Park because of the rising levels of the COVID-19. So in relation to that, do you find it necessary to even redefine COVID-19 beyond maybe the medical perspective? So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fana. Any other questions before I close? Okay, all right. Jackie and Leo, you can answer that as well as you make your concluding remarks. So let's start remarks. Let me start with Leo. Leo, go ahead.
Okay. So Fana, that's a good question. But for us, the way we've been thinking about this is there's no coherent story why, for example, the US would have so many infections, and here in Africa the infection rate is not that fast. So we don't know. It either could be temperature. It either could be, there were some papers that were saying people who have the BCG vaccine had some immunity, and so it's not coherent. So it's not a coherent story, and that the infection rate in the US is not. We cannot use it to explain, for example, what is happening in Africa. But I know that as this pandemic comes to close, as we pick and we'll be able to see those things more clearly and more coherently. So my concluding remarks is that as much as we should continue staying safe. You just continue being on the safe side, but at the same time be very active in terms of especially in terms of public policy, where your funds going, what is happening. Be very active, be very focused, because this would help. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Leo. So just maybe to chip in or add to what Fanon was asking, the only thing I would say is that the situation, I support what Leo is saying, but I also think that this COVID situation has illustrated that countries' response to this crisis also, besides the systems, the health systems, or how strong the health systems is, a number of factors have to come together to strengthen all countries' response to the crisis. So this is beyond looking at the health system. Different political factors have to come to place. We see that compliance to some of the directives that are given to respond to the crisis effectively, they've not been adhered to equally across in different states. For instance, in the US, we have had allegations of different states having a clear breach, or just the citizens have breaching certain protocols, certain directives, and so we see that compliance to the directives that were being issued in response to this is key, and people's willingness to comply to this crisis is strengthened by leaders that instill hope and confidence and are transparent in how they deal with the emergency. So there may be a deficit of that in the US. That may be one of the things that have caused, in my view, the rapid increase or the high number of cases. That's a breach or lack of compliance, and we see that the best approach for addressing this has been compliance and not obedience to the directives. So that may have been one of the contributing things that have caused that. Because if we are to discuss the health system only, they do have seemingly some of the best healthcare systems in the world. So I'll say that, and say that together with what Leo has said could be what is causing the situation as we've seen it in the States. In my closing remarks, I'd say that from our assessment, it's clear that a set of political risks or factors do have an influence in enabling or hindering countries' response to crisis. And what we can learn from this in terms of lessons learned and going forward is there's need to strengthen state capacity and just the ability to respond to crisis, because this may not be the last, it's likely not to be the last crisis or emergency of this nature that we have now. It had been predicted. Many people say that it caught states globally unaware, but not so. Our research has found that there had been predictions, in fact, of something like this. So what can we learn from this? Based on our highlight of the political risks and all the other factors that we've seen, we see the need now to build state capacities to respond to this and not be caught unawares in future. So universally, I would say there's need for decisive action grounded in science and good, strong policies to combat the crisis, but also put in place measures to prevent or to respond to emergencies of a similar scale in future. So thanks Kwame.
Okay. Thanks, Jackie and Leo. I think I'll just say that two things. One, whatever we might think, I think there are certain things that worked to Africa's advantage, because yes, it might be early in the day, but it's very, very clear that it has not had a devastating toll, even if I think the fact that there's theft, there's mismanagement and all that, in many cases Africa could have benefited from, or I would say certainly Kenya has benefited from the fact that we have a very young population, which in many cases means that they were less vulnerable than others, whatever that, at least so far, that might also explain it. It's also true that the fact that one of the areas, one of the ways in which COVID-19 is thought to be vulnerable is because it seems to be vulnerable to humidity and high temperatures. And so when it started the devastation in China, the early devastation in Kenya, in Europe and parts of North America, at that time, of course, those countries were in winter, which is a situation that also transmits flu and other places. So it's possible that many of these things. So as Leo said, as more knowledge gets accumulated, I think it will be better. It will be easier for countries to respond more, because actually part of state capability and intelligence is to be able to appropriate, or rather to consolidate and to synthesize information and find out what is the best way to protect citizens and to protect the public generally. It's also true that some of the failures of the US will have to be studied, because and I hear some of those things, so we need to educate ourselves at just how much you pay doctors. I mean, US doctors are among the highest paid. They earn an average of 4 times what the average salaries for doctors in the OECD, which is a group of 20 largest economies in the world, leading economies in the world. So certainly, it's not just how much you pay doctors. So the systems question, I think, is still there. And systems question is not how many doctors you have in place and all that, as you do, as we can tell in Kenya as well. If we are not providing frontline health workers with sufficient information, with sufficient equipment, then obviously we are putting them at risk, and that suggests that the entire health systems can be questioned for its competence and all that. One area in which maybe perhaps as the IEA we think that the Fragile State Index has been able to, if you map the Fragile State Index, it's tells us what some of those outcomes have been. I found quite interesting, and that tells you how state capacity in general needs to be built, because actually the performance under COVID-19 tells you how state capacity is an important thing, regardless of what we think happened in the US. And as Jackie has explained, even in the US, it's not one story. There's some states that did pretty well. I think New York had a bad run early, because that's where most of the epidemic started. And they had a very serious past 6 weeks. Since then, of course, they've come down, and actually their average is now much, much lower than the rest of the US. So the ability for the states to be trusted, to generate information, and actually to persuade citizens to listen and to act right, and to act in a way that prevents not only people, but prevents them from spreading the disease, is one of the things that has been put in place globally. And there's no single, as Leo said, there's no single performance that, well, democracies have performed in this way and others have performed differently. It's a mixed case depending on how states took, how the state institutions responded. So I guess that explains quite a bit of this. This continues to be studied, but on the whole, I think it's pretty clear now what needs to be done. People have to be careful. I think wearing masks does not hurt, even if people are reluctant to do it. And not only wearing masks, but basically observing those regulations properly. If you want to wear a mask, please wear the mask properly. Wearing it on your chin is not useful. I'm not sure. No. Okay. And so that's basically it. So I'd like to thank my colleagues Leo and Jackie. Thank you very much for preparing the paper, and thanks for the presentation today. The presentation will be available together with a recording of this discussion. Will be available for all of us to link to. So that link will be provided right after this meeting, and you can watch it again. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to send it to Jackie and Leo so that we can have another discussion. I think we can promise that we will discuss this. As we said, there are 3 chapters of the 11 in the book. 3 chapters were prepared by the IEA. So this we've handled, which is basically the fragile states and the political risks. The second area would be the economic resilience, and the third theme was on macroeconomic management, which is basically fiscal policy in terms of the economic stimulus, government spending, and at the same time how government has responded to governments in Africa have responded. So we've taken a few case studies here and there to build what we think is a persuasive case about what or rather is an indicative case about how Africa did. Remember, this was the first 100 days. Subsequently, we might update this and actually get more information. But I'd like to thank you all for being here, and thanks a lot again, Jackie and Leo, for putting this forward. We have 2 more chapters which will send a notice and provide either this week or the next week and the week after that, so that we have we share this information and the data with you and have an opportunity to discuss it. As I conclude, I'm thankful to the fact that we have some members of the IEA who've attended today. Thank you very much. And for the audience, please note that the IEA is an organization with members. We are building our membership, and if you would like to please look through our website for the membership forms, please fill it, and we'll be welcome for you to be members of the IEA. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and have a good morning. And thanks again, Jackie and Leo, for this good work. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie and Leo.
Yeah.